And on now to another important topic as we continue with the IFCA International Compliance Congress. And today we're looking at tools and mechanisms. Now, global trade compliance, understanding the global landscape with regard to issues like sanctions, restricted parties, screening, and also anti-boycotting. I want to introduce our moderator to you, Mariella Melhem, who is a partner, corporate compliance and crisis management practices at Mitrani Caballero and Ruiz Moreno. Mariella is a partner of the corporate and mergers and acquisitions and compliance and crisis management practices at that firm in Buenos Aires in Argentina. She is an expert in domestic and international business law, investment projects, mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, global trade compliance involving multiple jurisdictions. She will introduce her panel. You can see their photographs on the screen. And Mariella, I welcome you to the Congress.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us, and welcome to this trade compliance session. We have a great panel today. Joining me for this panel, we have two trade compliance experts. First is Timothy O'Toole, who is a member of Miller Chevalier, based in Washington, D.C. He's a leader of the White Collar Defense Practice Group and co-leads the Economic Sanctions and Export Control Regulations practice. Tim has been conducting and leading large-scale defense investigations for 20 years. Although Tim has substantial experience in all areas of white collars, his main focus is on defending enforcement actions and conducting investigations involving economic sanctions, export controls, service security, anti-money laundering laws. Has been recognized as one of the leading international trade lawyers in the U.S. by Chambers USA, Legal 500, Who's Who Legal, and Global Investigation Review. Prior to joining Miller Chevalier, Tim has served as a chief as a special litigation division of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, where, among other things, he managed and conducted large-scale criminal defense investigations for matters pending in the local and federal courts. He has a JD at the University of Virginia School of Law, 1990. Thank you very much, Tim, for joining the panel. Next, we have Pablo Giordano, who is a senior manager of trade compliance for South America at Stanley Black & Decker and has over 13 years of experience in trade compliance and 22 years in international trade. Pablo's technical background includes expertise in import and export compliance, restricted party screening, dual-use goods, origin determination, ATS, HES classification, customer broker oversight, and supply chain security. Pablo holds a degree in business administration and a post-degree in international trade and integration process, both obtained from the University of Buenos Aires. He has successfully implemented global trade compliance programs for corporations throughout South America. Our session today will address the main trends that are moving forward during 2021 in relation to sanctions. In particular, the most recent actions taken by the Biden administration during this year. Our experts will share their experience and knowledge in relation to restricted parties screening and the challenges that arise when implementing a compliance or trade compliance program in South America. And then some brief keynotes on anti-boycott regulations. As a way of introduction, let me say that as the world was unsettled by the COVID-19 pandemic with unprecedented economic, political, and social consequences, the leading issuing agencies, sanction agencies, remain pretty active despite the global pandemic. After the past 12 months has been distinguished by significant increase in the number of changes introduced by authorities. The sanction landscape is still very complex and dynamic. The main challenge for businesses and organizations across all industries is keeping pace of the several changes that are introduced in the sanctions regime by the authorities, as well as responding to the evolving OFAC and the new OFAC guidance under the new Biden administration and the UK departure from the European Union, among others. Summarizing by a way of introduction the main changes, we can say that following Brexit, the UK has started its own path with independent sanction framework. It has triggered human rights sanction programs with targets in China, Myanmar, North Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, an anti-corruption program as well with targets in South Africa, Latin America, Russia, and South Africa and South Sudan as well. As you know, early this year, the UK government has issued the Global Anti-Corruption Sanctions Regulations, putting in place a sanctions measures regime to prevent and to combat serious corruption. By means of this regime, the UK Parliament has the authority to designate persons, both entities and individuals, to combat by way of asset freeze or by way of travel restrictions in an effort to prevent and combat serious corruption. From the European, I would say that in general, the UK has evidence that has been pretty active as a new player in the role of sanctions. And of course, it looks like it will have a very active role as well in enforcing its regulations. From the export control regulation regime point of view, the UK remains pretty closely aligned to the European Union, with it added some complexities in terms of licensing requirements as well. From the European Union perspective, I can say that the European Union has been pretty active as well by designating different programs, including Russian officials, Russian individuals, Venezuela's officials, and Belarus and Myanmar governmental officials as well. It has published certain guidelines on Myanmar sanctions. It has suspended the renewal, the extension of the investment agreement with China as well due to human reasons concern. And it has implemented for the first time since 2009 the reform to its export control regime by including new technologies and goods into the export control dual use list. And for finishing, I would say I will anticipate what Tim will explain in relation to the US. The US remain pretty active. As usual, OFAC has been has faster included almost more than 500 designations, new designations during 2021. And it has announced a major package of new sanctions against Russia due to cybersecurity breaches, election interference, and as well as what relates to new potential threats of incursions in UK. And it has also announced coordinated efforts with the UK, the European Union, and Canada, with several sanctions programs that are more focused on human rights defenses in relation to Belarus, Myanmar, China, and Russia. So having departing here from the US, where you are right now, Tim, let's get it started. And I'm going to ask you about, if you can, could you please give the audience a brief overview of the US sanctions and export control policy that this new administration has implemented so far during the current year?
Absolutely, Mariela, and good morning to everyone. So one of the things about the Biden administration that has been a little bit surprising is that it has mostly continued the Trump administration sanctions policies. And so particularly when we come to the embargoed countries, these are the countries that the U.S. has sanctioned most heavily. On that list, we have Cuba, where the Biden administration has really not changed the policy at all. Syria, pretty much the same story. Syria is subject to a full embargo of the U.S. That embargo remains in place. North Korea, the same thing, and the Crimea region of Russia is also under embargo, and the Biden administration has not really changed the policies from what they were in the Trump administration. The one exception to that would be Iran. The Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often referred to as the nuclear deal. The Biden administration has been in negotiations to return to the nuclear deal. There has been a sticking point because after the U.S. withdrew, Iran increased its nuclear program. The negotiations are about how to rejoin the deal. So with the U.S. lifting the sanctions that the Trump administration put back into place, but Iran at the same time pulling back its nuclear program to the limits set by the nuclear deal. That's really the sticking point. But it is the big change in the Biden administration from the Trump administration on those issues. As Mariella mentioned, in the non-embargoed but heavily sanctioned countries, there have been some big developments. The Biden administration has really ratcheted up the sanctions against Belarus in light of the incident involving the journalist and the airliner in the spring. In Myanmar, after the coup took place in January, the U.S. administration has restarted a Myanmar sanctions program that has ratcheted up. These programs are still list-based. That is, that it's not an embargo, so there's not a restriction on dealing with the territory of a particular country. There are just restrictions on dealing with certain parties. But the number of listed parties in Belarus, the number of listed parties in Myanmar, and really Russia and Venezuela probably belong on that list as well. Those countries, there has not been really an increase in the sanctions, but they have remained the same, and those sanctions policies remain in place. The one other area that I would want to talk about in terms of the Biden administration sanctions policies is really China. The Trump administration actually started 3 sanctions programs against China, one related to the autonomy of Hong Kong, one related to China's policy with respect to the Uyghurs, and then the third policy was sanctions program was related to Chinese military companies. All 3 of those programs remain in place, although the Biden administration has pulled back on the sanctions with respect to Chinese military companies. Honestly, it has made some differences that has made that program a lot more workable than it was originally, because the listing process under the Trump administration had some real problems with it that we think have been ironed out in the Biden administration. It certainly seems like a more predictable program, but it is still in place. They haven't pulled it back. There was one sanctions policy that was repealed by the Biden administration. That was the Trump administration had an entire program for the International Court of Justice based on a dispute with the International Court of Justice. Thankfully, that's been repealed. So that's kind of the lay of the land on the Biden administration sanctions policies compared to where they were under the Trump administration.
Thank you, Tim. And what are your expectations for the next month, for the incoming months, besides what you just mentioned about Iran? Yes.
So in the next few months, I do think that they'll still be studying. One program that I didn't mention was Afghanistan. So Afghanistan has recently returned to the Taliban leadership, and the Taliban is actually a specially designated global terrorist organization under U.S. law. And so it becomes much more difficult to deal with Afghanistan because of the status of the Taliban. There have been some changes in the last month or so with respect to what they call general licenses, which allow U.S. persons and other persons to deal with the Taliban in certain circumstances, humanitarian aid being the main one. I expect that program will be changed rather considerably in the coming months. I think that there will be likely an increase in sanctions against Myanmar unless there's some resolution of that conflict. And I believe that the sanctions against Belarus will probably continue to increase over the coming months as well.
Perfect. One of the major sanctions compliance and enforcement issues that the companies are facing in the current market is to introduce that, to ensure that they are not dealing with directly or indirectly with prohibited or sanctioned entities. This is a nightmare for the company. So what strategies can companies implement to ensure compliance? And if you can also tell us, would such strategies be the same for small or medium-sized companies? Because we are always focused, on multinational companies. But this is not the case, probably it's not the same for medium and small companies.
Absolutely. I think that, one of the things that OFAC emphasizes, and I try to emphasize it as well, is that companies need to establish what they call a risk-based compliance program. So if your risks are big in a particular area, then you're going to need to do more to comply. And if your risks are small, you might in some circumstances need to do less to comply. From the multinational perspective, I mean, I think screening is really the main protection against sanctions violations, and the more screening, the better. And what I mean by that is, many companies have a screening program that not only includes all of their counterparties, but then is constantly updated so that if they have a counterparty that is not sanctioned when they start doing business with them, then they become sanctioned. The constant updates will let them know that now they're dealing with a sanctioned party and they can take steps accordingly. One of the questions that I get a lot with respect to screening is that because it seems like it would be automatic, there are companies who think that you can just put the screening program in place and then you don't have to worry anymore. But the problem is that you still need a human being to actually look at the screening results and tell you what they mean. And so that's still kind of the key to a good screening program, is not just having the program in place that updates if you can afford that, but also to make sure that you have somebody who understands the results, understands when you actually have a true hit, understands if the hit comes up, what you can and can't do with the party who shows up on that list. A lot of these screening programs can be complicated because they give what I view as almost too many hits. So they screen against lists, and you get this hit, but it turns out that list really doesn't have any real consequences in terms of whether you can deal with them. And so you need somebody who's skilled in reading what a screening result is. For smaller companies, for medium-sized companies, they may not have the resources to implement these, large scale, constantly updated screening programs. And so, it depends on the size of the volume, but if the volume is small, and certainly if your risk is small because you're just not dealing with a lot of countries that are heavily sanctioned, you may even have someone manually just reviewing the higher risk transactions by going to OFAC screening list or going to the EU screening list and just manually searching yourself. One of the other things that I try to do when I work with companies in terms of identifying risk for screening is to just determine, where are your high risk transactions? And if you are engaging in some high risk transactions, are those transactions also being screened by banks? Because, OFAC, it regulates many different types of businesses, but the main industry that it really started regulating and is still probably most heavily regulated is the financial industry. And so, whenever financial transactions take place, the banks have very sophisticated screening tools that allow them to essentially stop these sorts of transactions mid-tracks. And so if you're a small or medium-sized business, sometimes you can look and see if those transactions that you're dealing with are being screened by the banks, so that the banks can essentially do some of your screening for you. And so, when we try to look at your risk, we also look at whether or not some of those risks are mitigated by other entities that are doing the screening so that you don't have to.
That's correct. And one of the difficulties that I found usually with the customers is when complying with the 50% rule of OFAC, is how do I need to go all the way, up to the final beneficiary? Why do I have to screen, all the layers of shareholders? And what happens if, the companies can get the information? Sometimes information is publicly available and sometimes not. And there's some reluctancy, sometimes in your counterparties to provide that that information, because it's confidential. So what would you recommend in that respect?
So the 50% rule is one of the most difficult rules to comply with, because unlike the rest of the world, OFAC has sanctioned parties that don't appear on any list, because under the OFAC 50% rule, if a company is 50% owned by a listed company, it has to be treated as sanctioned as well, even though the company that you're dealing with is not on any list and you can't find it from screening. So that's hard enough. But then actually finding ownership information, like you just pointed out, Mariella, can be very hard because your counterparties don't want to give it to you. Searching ownership information in some countries, Russia comes to mind because I've had some real difficulties there searching ownership information. It can be really tough. And so, I mean, what I tell clients to do is run it as far as you reasonably can, and then take a look at the whether this is a particularly risky transaction. So, for example, if you have reason to believe that your counterparty might be owned by a sanctioned party, you're going to want to do a lot more in terms of due diligence than if you really, you're dealing with a low sanctioned country, have no real reason to believe that there is some sanctioned party in the ownership chain. You may not need to do as much. And so I think you really do have to look at your risk going in to determine how much diligence you need to do. It can be very hard sometimes, and it's not an easy rule to comply with.
Definitely. One last question, Tim, is in relation to the U.S. anti-boycott regulations. What would be for U.S. and non-U.S. companies, your recommendations in terms of compliance strategies, and if there is any chance that the Biden administration would revamp them, anytime soon?
So yeah, the anti-boycott rules I find very tricky, and I deal with them all the time because basically the anti-boycott program was set up in the 70s by the U.S. to try and stop the Arab League boycott against Israel, or to at least make it harder. And so it's that boycott is what the U.S. would call an unsanctioned boycott. And so the goal of the anti-boycott regulations is to try and keep U.S. persons from participating in unsanctioned boycotts, but it's mainly the Arab League boycott against Israel. And so it essentially looks at whether or not there is a refusal to do business with Israel, or if you've been asked to not to do business with Israel. And if that it turns out to be the case, one, U.S. persons can't participate in that boycott, but two, they have certain reporting obligations. So they have to report either to our Treasury Department or to our Commerce Department. Figuring out whether or not there is an anti-boycott request can be extremely tricky. I mean, it's things as simple as a request to sign a contract that says you'll comply with all laws. In some countries where part of the law is the boycott of Israel, can be a request to participate in a boycott and can be a boycott violation. So I find it very tricky, but I think the biggest thing that I would say is if you're doing business at all in the Middle East, and particularly in the countries that still are boycotting Israel, you really do need to study the regulations closely, because they'll probably come up at some point in your business there.
Sorry, I was unmuted. Let's move on to Pablo. As I was saying, in your experience, Pablo, as a senior manager of trade compliance for Stanley Black & Decker, which are the main challenges that you have encountered when implementing the trade compliance program in South America?
Maya, thanks a lot. I think that the big challenge on the company is to try to establish the trade compliance as part of the culture of the company, especially because in most of the countries on South America, trade compliance department is not part of the departments in the company. Only few companies are having this department, so it's something very new for all. And just to give an example, the HTS classification is usually delegated on the custom brokers, or for example, in the case of Brazil, in the tax department. So if the company didn't have an appropriate follow-up, an appropriate check, and appropriate oversight over the custom broker, they could face a lot of issues regarding the HTS classification, like import requirements that are not accomplished. In Argentina and Brazil especially, they have a lot of import license. So the wrong HTS could mean that you have to obtain a license and you didn't. There is anti-dumping regulation that are linked also with the HTS. And this is only one of the examples. Yes, it also means that be part of the culture in the company means to change the mindset regarding the custom broker, for example. If you don't have a trade compliance department, the custom broker is the part who take out the things out from the customs and deliver to your warehouse. But taking consideration the perspective of the trade compliance, the custom broker is an intermediary between the customs and the company, or in other words, between the government agency and the company. So it means that it could be a possible corruption, bribery. So it's necessary to recheck if you have a contract or not, because in most of the cases, the custom broker didn't have a contract with the company. So it means that you have to obtain a contract, to check in this contract the language is according with the anti-bribery, anti-boycott, anti-corruption clauses, to recheck the SOP, to check if the documents are in a proper way, if they are following a proper flow, if the record keeping is okay with the local regulations. In Argentina, you have to keep these documents up to the customs for some time. So there is a lot of things that usually are not taken in consideration, but are part of the trade compliance perspective. So also what we have in South America is the Mercosur. Mercosur is conforming by a lot of countries in South America, but it's a challenge because despite it started in 1991, it didn't have fully integrated. So what it means is that each country has their own import and export regulation, and also they have their own import taxes, free trade agreements. So a difference of Europe, where you have a really integrated bloc, here is each country has different regulations that you have to accomplish. Also different systems, the customs are not integrated. So it's a lot of regulations that handle the import and export in all the region. If we go to another more super specific things is Argentina and Mexico are part of the Way-Smart Agreement. It means that almost none of the import and export teams in the region knows about dual-use materials, ECCN, export control list, and it's something that they are not also teaching in universities. So you have the difficulty that the countries that are part of the Way-Smart agreements is not part of the education, and in the other countries are not part of the Way-Smart agreement. So it means that in the region there is no specialist on ECCN classification. This is an extra challenge because it's necessary to teach all the people around the companies and around the countries about this. And well, Timothy was speaking about a screening. So we face different issues. One of the issues, for example, in Colombia is we have to teach the distributor, especially near of the Venezuelan border, about USA export regulations. So we have to deliver, imagine that it's a local distributor, and from one day to another, we started to explain about why USA is restricting with Venezuela, why we have to make the screening, why they're a distributor, they have to take a special consideration, and why in our contracts and in the PO, we have to add special clauses regarding the accomplish of the USA export regulation. Because at the moment of when we sell to a distributor, it's not possible to know who will be the end user of these materials. So at the end, the challenge is a big combo of different things where it's a lot of education, a lot of training, and it's try to change the mindset and the perspective from the import and export department regarding all these regulations.
And how, Pablo, does the company deal with the lack of information on the ownership structure, of customers and suppliers, for example, in practice?
Well, in practice, is one of the things that also Timothy mentioned before. We have to know our customers. The first thing is to know our customers, know where we will operate with this. Stanley has different business units. So one business unit is the drills, but another is from engineering. So in engineering, we have a lot of challenges because in this case, it's necessary to know, okay, I will sell you this, but where you will apply, which will be your final customers. If we don't have this information, we can't proceed. So we have to explain not only the customer, but also to the sales department the need to have this information and to really know our customer and where our tools will be used. So this is one of the challenge. And I think that not in the regular channels, but we face a lot of issues with the e-commerce. So, during the pandemic, we started with the e-commerce, and the e-commerce multiply by 20 or 30 times the volume of the operation. And one of the big challenges was to have the enough information to make the screening. Yes, in this case, for example, it happened a lot that when you ask for the name, they put the nickname or an email, or other thing that happen is that you will send a gift, like for example for Amazon. So I will pay it, but it will be shipped to Mariela. So we have to make two screening in that case, because we will have to make the screening over the people who is paying, but also who will receive the goods. And this was a lot of challenge, because also the platforms force the company to deliver in 24 or 48 hours at maximum. So we have to find a way, and I speak a lot with the e-commerce team and with the platforms in order to let them understand that it will be necessary to have this information. Otherwise, we will not able to deliver the goods, because at the end we are responsible for our products and the people who will receive it. In that case, we have to establish an SOP with the different platforms in order to say, okay, our reputation will be not affected in case that we will not have this information, and this information, at least the basic information to make the screening, because it will be impact in a negative way in our delivery. So this is one of the big challenge, no? No, I'm sorry, Mariela, that you are.
Just to, yes, sorry, Pablo, just to wrap up, and it would be interesting to know, how did you manage, the whatever it relates to intangible property, that it's another big issue, and that probably during the pandemic was a matter of concern, working remotely, transfer of info in the cloud by email, or by even handing over, a USB to a colleague. How did you handle that, and do you believe it did entail further risk for the company?
Well, this is one of the big challenge in 2020, because as you know, and it's happening all around the world, the pandemic started one day and prolonged during 2 years. So it's not something that you can be totally prepared. We have to work a lot with IT, because our big concern was in the sensitive information that the employees could have in their computers. So we have to establish a clear SOP regarding how they will storage the information, where they will have access. We have to be sure that has secured access like VPN or another control access to the digital ways. We have to reinforce and work a lot and deliver a lot of training, explaining the need to storage all the information in a secure place, like our own servers or the cloud authorized by the company, because it could happen all the things. The computer could be exposed if you are not using your networks. The computer could be stalled, and you have all information there. And you know that the other challenge was for trade compliance, because the technology transfer, but also other concerns about the data privacy laws that we have in all the countries. So let's assume that I will not say that in the engineering department we have a draw of our product that will be a typical example, but let's say about the sales or the customers, if the database is in a marketing person has the database of our customers and the computer is installed. So this is a violation of the data privacy, because someone could take this information and sell it. So we have a lot of challenges and a lot of concerns regarding the security of the information that we have there. So we base a lot of e-learning platforms where we deliver a lot of trainings. We have a lot of time with Zoom trainings or other platforms trainings in order to ensure this. So this is one of the things.
Thank you so much, both Tim and Pablo. It was really nice hearing to you. We'll pass on to Jeremy Max, the Q&A session at this time. I guess you're...
No, Maria, I am here, and thank you very much indeed. I'm just looking at the questions that have been posed. And just one in the chat room says that we were looking at global compliance as the broad overarching topic of this conversation, and particularly understanding the global landscape. The question for compliance officers is, how do they better understand that landscape? What do they need to do? What's their jump-off point? What's the starting position for them?
Tim, do you want to address that one?
Sure. So I think from the perspective of a compliance official, understanding the full landscape is really about trying to keep up with what's happening in terms of sanctions, what's happening in terms of export controls. It does require some training like this one. We talked a little bit earlier about the sort of tools that you need, but I think that it, particularly with respect to sanctions, the rules change almost every day. And so you do have to keep up with the landscape so that you know kind of what to watch out for.
Thank you, James.
And that's where we are going to leave it. And I'm going to thank you very much indeed for a very insightful panel this afternoon, as we will then move on to our next session. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts as we prepare to take compliance professionals to greater heights.